What if I told you that multiple Tower of London guards have quit their jobs after encountering the same terrifying apparition night after night? A headless woman in Tudor dress, carrying her own severed head, walking the exact path from her prison cell to the scaffold where she died. This isn't some Halloween ghost story or tourist attraction gimmick. This is Anne Boleyn, and her documented appearances have been witnessed by everyone from yeoman warders to members of the British royal family themselves. But here's what will shock you most. The reason she can't rest has nothing to do with her execution, and everything to do with a secret that died with her nearly 500 years ago. But before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Our story begins in the tumultuous reign of King Henry VIII, when the Tower of London served not merely as a royal palace, but as England's most feared prison and execution site. Built by William the Conqueror in 1066, this imposing fortress on the Thames had already witnessed centuries of political intrigue, torture, and death by the time Anne Boleyn first set foot within its walls as Queen of England in 1533. Anne Boleyn, born around 1501, was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier who sought to elevate his family's position through his daughter's connections to the royal court. Unlike the conventional noble ladies of her time, Anne possessed a sharp intellect, fierce independence, and magnetic charisma that would ultimately capture the attention of the most powerful man in England. She had spent her formative years in the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France, returning to England as a cultured, educated young woman who spoke fluent French and possessed an understanding of European politics that far exceeded most of her contemporaries. When King Henry VIII first encountered Anne Boleyn in 1526, he was already married to Catherine of Aragon, but their union had failed to produce the male heir Henry desperately needed to secure the Tudor dynasty. Anne's dark eyes, elegant neck, and witty conversation captivated the king completely. Unlike his previous mistresses, Anne refused to become merely another royal conquest. She demanded marriage, legitimacy, and the crown itself. What followed would reshape English history forever. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn led him to break with the Roman Catholic Church, establish himself as supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolve his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope's refusal to annul Henry's first marriage sparked the English Reformation, fundamentally altering the religious landscape of the nation. Anne Boleyn had become the catalyst for one of the most significant political and religious upheavals in European history. The couple secretly married in November 1532, and Anne was crowned Queen of England in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey on June 1st, 1533. The Tower of London, traditionally the starting point for royal coronation processions, welcomed its new queen with great pageantry. Anne processed through the same gates where she would later meet her doom, carried in a litter of white cloth of gold, her long dark hair flowing freely as befitted an unmarried woman according to medieval custom, though she was already secretly Henry's wife and pregnant with their child. The birth of Princess Elizabeth in September 1533 initially disappointed Henry, who had risked everything for a male heir, but he remained devoted to Anne. However, the Queen's failure to produce subsequent living children began to strain their relationship. Anne suffered multiple miscarriages, including the devastating loss of a male child in January 1536. Each pregnancy lost represented not just personal tragedy, but political catastrophe for a woman whose position depended entirely upon providing the king with sons. As Anne's influence waned, her enemies at court grew bolder. The Seymour family, particularly Jane Seymour, began capturing Henry's attention. Anne's sharp tongue, once charming to the king, now seemed shrewish and inappropriate. Her religious reforms, previously supported by Henry, were now viewed as dangerously radical. The very independence and intelligence that had initially attracted the king now appeared threatening to his absolute authority. The events of May 1536 would change everything. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and incest with her brother George Boleyn. The accusations were almost certainly fabricated, constructed by Thomas Cromwell and Anne's political enemies to provide Henry with grounds for divorce and remarriage. The specific charges claimed she had committed adultery with multiple men, including court musicians and nobles, and had conspired to murder the king. Anne was transported to the Tower of London by royal barge on May 2nd, 1536, entering through the Traitor's Gate beneath a gray spring sky. The woman who had once processed through these gates as queen now arrived as a prisoner, facing charges that carried the death penalty. She was confined to the same royal apartments where she had stayed before her coronation, a cruel irony that must have tormented her during her final days. The trials were mere formalities. Anne and her alleged accomplices were condemned to death based on flimsy evidence and coerced confessions. Henry, already planning his marriage to Jane Seymour, showed no mercy to the woman for whom he had defied the Pope and transformed England. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to her execution on Tower Green, wearing a dark gray gown and a white coif that covered her famous dark hair. The execution itself was unprecedented. Rather than the traditional axe used for English beheadings, Henry had summoned an expert swordsman from Calais to ensure a swift, clean death. Anne Boleyn knelt upright, her hands bound, and spoke her final words. "Good Christian people, I come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die." With one swift stroke, the French sword severed her head from her neck, ending the life of England's most controversial queen. Little did anyone know that this tragic execution would bind Anne Boleyn's spirit to the Tower of London for centuries to come. The first documented supernatural encounter with Anne Boleyn's ghost occurred just decades after her execution, with the most detailed early account from Captain of the Guard Edmund Lenthal Swift in 1864, who described experiences that had been whispered about among Tower staff for generations. According to Captain Swift's official report to the War Office, the initial supernatural activity began as subtle but unmistakable phenomena that defied rational explanation. Tower guards reported bone-chilling cold spots that appeared suddenly in the exact location where the scaffold once stood on Tower Green. These temperature drops were so severe that guards' breath became visible even during warm summer nights, and several reported feeling as though icy fingers were trailing across the backs of their necks. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced in 30 years of military service, Captain Swifty testified in his official report. A cold so penetrating it seemed to freeze the very marrow in my bones, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of profound sadness that brought grown men to tears without explanation. Guards consistently reported that these episodes occurred most frequently during the early morning hours, particularly around the time when Anne Boleyn's execution had taken place at 8 o'clock in the morning. The supernatural phenomena escalated to include unexplained sounds that echoed through the tower's ancient corridors. Multiple witnesses described hearing the soft rustle of silk gowns moving across stone floors, though no living person was present. The sounds were always accompanied by the delicate clicking of high-heeled shoes, consistent with the fashion of the Tudor court. These auditory manifestations followed a specific pattern, beginning at the Queen's house where Anne had been imprisoned, proceeding along the exact route she would have taken to her execution, and ending abruptly at Tower Green. William Thompson, a yeoman warder who served at the Tower from 1845 to 1872, provided chilling testimony about recurring electrical disturbances that plagued the fortress. Every candle in the White Tower would flicker simultaneously, as though some invisible presence was moving past each flame, Thompson reported in his memoir. The silence that followed was so complete and oppressive that it felt like the tower itself was holding its breath, in terror. Most disturbing were the reports of an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Guards standing duty near Tower Green consistently reported feeling observed by an invisible presence, describing the sensation as being studied by someone with intimate knowledge of great suffering. Several guards requested transfers to other posts, unable to endure the psychological pressure of constant supernatural scrutiny. The pattern of Anne Boleyn's ghostly behavior began to emerge from these early encounters. The supernatural activity always occurred in locations directly connected to her final days: her prison chambers, the route to her execution, and the site of her death. The ghost seemed trapped in an endless cycle, reliving her final journey repeatedly. What happened next would escalate these subtle supernatural signs into far more dramatic manifestations. The most significant escalation in Anne Boleyn's ghostly manifestations occurred during the Victorian era, when multiple independent witnesses began reporting actual visual apparitions of the executed queen. The testimony of Colonel Gordon Wilson, resident governor of the Tower from 1881 to 1896, provides the most comprehensive documentation of these increasingly dramatic supernatural encounters. According to Colonel Wilson's detailed report to Queen Victoria herself, the paranormal activity had evolved far beyond mysterious sounds and temperature changes. On the night of October 15, 1887, 3 separate Tower guards reported seeing a translucent female figure moving across Tower Green, carrying what appeared to be her own severed head tucked beneath her left arm. The figure wore a dark gown consistent with Tudor-era mourning dress, and her long, dark hair flowed freely despite the complete absence of any wind. The apparition was so vivid and detailed that Guard Sergeant Matthews initially believed he was observing a living person in period costume, Colonel Wilson documented in his official correspondence, only realizing the supernatural nature of the encounter when the figure passed directly through the iron gates without opening them, leaving Matthews in a state of complete nervous collapse that required medical attention. The ghost's behavior during these encounters revealed disturbing patterns that connected directly to Anne Boleyn's historical circumstances. Witnesses consistently reported that the apparition would pause at specific locations, seeming to interact with invisible figures from her past. At the site of her former royal apartments, the ghost was observed curtsying deeply, as though greeting King Henry VIII himself. Near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne's headless body had been hastily buried, the spectre would kneel and appear to be praying, her lips moving silently while her severed head remained tucked against her side. The supernatural encounters reached their most intense during the anniversary dates connected to Anne's imprisonment and execution. Tower chaplain Reverend Dr. James Morton documented extraordinary paranormal activity during the nights of May 2nd through May 19th each year. The very stones of the tower seemed to remember her agony, Reverend Morton wrote in his private journal, as though the fortress itself becomes a theater where history's most tragic drama replays itself annually with supernatural precision. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Anne Boleyn's ghost interacting with other spectral figures, suggesting that the tower's supernatural residents formed a community of tormented spirits. Lady Margaret Pole, executed by Henry VIII in 1541, was reportedly seen approaching Anne's ghost on Tower Green, both figures seeming to find comfort in their shared fate as victims of royal tyranny. The most disturbing aspect of these escalating encounters was the ghost's apparent awareness of living observers. Unlike typical apparitions that seem oblivious to contemporary witnesses, Anne Boleyn's spirit appeared to recognize and even communicate with the living. Tower guard William Henderson reported that during his encounter in March 1892, the ghost made direct eye contact with him and appeared to mouth words, though no sound emerged. The psychological impact on Tower staff became so severe that the War Office implemented special protocols for guards assigned to night duty. Official records from 1894 indicate that requests for transfers had increased by 300%, with guards citing supernatural harassment as their primary reason for seeking reassignment. The escalating supernatural encounters were building toward something even more dramatic and terrifying. The most extraordinary and terrifying encounter with Anne Boleyn's ghost occurred on the night of May 19, 1921, exactly 385 years after her execution. This climactic supernatural event was witnessed by multiple credible observers and documented in official Tower records, representing the most dramatic manifestation of Anne Boleyn's spirit ever recorded. The witnesses included Tower Resident Governor Major General Sir Francis Davies, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison of the Scots Guards, Tower Chaplain Reverend William Grant, and 3 yeoman warders conducting their regular midnight rounds. The convergence of so many credible military and religious officials created an unprecedented opportunity to document supernatural phenomena with scientific precision and institutional authority. According to Major General Davies's confidential report to the War Office, the encounter began at precisely 11:45 in the evening, with atmospheric disturbances that affected the entire Tower complex. Every electric light within the fortress began flickering in perfect synchronization, creating a strobe effect that cast dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The temperature throughout the Tower grounds dropped precipitously, with thermometers recording a decrease of 20 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes. At the stroke of midnight, Anne Boleyn materialized on Tower Green with a clarity and substance that surpassed all previous supernatural encounters. Unlike earlier apparitions described as translucent or shimmering, this manifestation appeared completely solid and lifelike, as though the executed queen had somehow returned to physical existence. She wore an elaborate black velvet gown trimmed with ermine, identical to contemporary portraits painted during her reign, and her famous B-initial pearl necklace gleamed around her throat. Most shocking of all, Anne Boleyn's head rested securely upon her shoulders, her dark eyes blazing with an intelligence and fury that transcended death itself. Her long dark hair flowed freely around her shoulders, and her pale complexion possessed an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to generate its own soft light in the darkness. When Anne Boleyn's spirit reached within 10 feet of the observers, she stopped and spoke in a voice that echoed with supernatural power and centuries of accumulated anguish. Major General Davies reported that her words rang out with perfect clarity, though they seemed to emanate from the very stones of the tower rather than from the ghost's lips. "I am Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, wrongfully condemned and murdered by a king who feared the power of truth," the spirit proclaimed, her voice carrying the authority of royal command mixed with the pain of ultimate betrayal. "I return each year to this place of injustice, not for revenge, but to ensure that history remembers what was done here in the name of political convenience and masculine pride." The ghost then performed the most extraordinary supernatural feat ever documented at the Tower of London. Anne Boleyn reached up with both hands and deliberately removed her head from her shoulders, holding it at arm's length while her headless body remained standing. The severed head continued speaking, its eyes fixed directly on the witnesses with burning intensity. As dawn approached, Anne Boleyn carefully replaced her head upon her shoulders and walked slowly toward the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, fading gradually until she vanished completely at the chapel's entrance. Contemporary sightings of Anne Boleyn's ghost continue to this day, demonstrating that her supernatural presence remains as powerful and active as ever within the Tower of London's ancient walls. Modern witnesses include tower staff, yeoman warders, tourists, and even members of the British royal family, creating a documented pattern of ongoing paranormal activity that spans from medieval times to the 21st century. Chief Yeoman Warder John Donald, who served at the tower from 1995 to 2015, documented multiple encounters with Anne Boleyn's spirit during his tenure. According to Donald's official incident reports, the Queen's ghost continues to appear most frequently during the anniversary of her execution, but sightings now occur throughout the year with increasing frequency. "She's becoming more active," Donald testified in a 2010 interview with the Tower's Historical Research Department, "as though something is drawing her spirit more strongly to this world." Modern security camera systems have captured unexplained phenomena consistent with Anne Boleyn's ghostly manifestations. Tower Security Chief Sarah Williams reported that surveillance equipment regularly malfunctions in areas associated with the Queen's imprisonment and execution, with cameras automatically shutting down or recording impossibly distorted images during supernatural encounters. "The technology seems incapable of properly documenting her presence," Williams noted, "as though her spiritual energy interferes with electronic systems." Recent visitors have provided testimony that mirrors historical accounts with remarkable consistency. Tourist Margaret Chen from Canada reported her encounter during a 2019 visit. "I was taking photographs near Tower Green when the temperature suddenly dropped, and I felt someone watching me. When I turned around, I saw a woman in Tudor dress walking toward the chapel, but she was translucent and seemed to be floating just above the ground." Professional paranormal investigators who have studied the tower with official permission consistently report electromagnetic disturbances and temperature anomalies in locations connected to Anne Boleyn's story. Dr. Rebecca Matthews, a researcher specializing in historical hauntings, documented significant energy readings during her 2022 investigation. "The paranormal activity at the tower is among the most consistent and powerful I've encountered," Dr. Matthews concluded, suggesting that Anne Boleyn's spirit remains deeply connected to this location. The tower's current staff acknowledge Anne Boleyn's continued presence with a mixture of professional acceptance and personal unease. Curator Elizabeth Hartford noted that many employees report feeling observed while working alone in areas connected to the Queen's imprisonment. "She's part of the tower's living history," Hartford explained, "a reminder that some injustices transcend death itself." What keeps Anne Boleyn's tortured spirit bound to the Tower of London after nearly 5 centuries? Perhaps the answer lies not in supernatural folklore, but in the fundamental human need for justice and recognition. Anne Boleyn was destroyed by political convenience, her reputation shattered by manufactured evidence, and her legacy overshadowed by the very king who ordered her death. Her ghost may represent something far more profound than mere paranormal activity: the eternal protest of truth against power, dignity against tyranny. The witnesses who have encountered Anne Boleyn's spirit consistently report the same overwhelming impression. This is not a vengeful ghost seeking to harm the living, but a wronged queen demanding that history remember the injustice done to her. Her supernatural manifestations seem designed to preserve the truth of her story, ensuring that future generations understand the real cost of unchecked royal power and political persecution. Perhaps some bonds are too strong for death to break. Not bonds of love or hatred, but bonds of unresolved injustice that can only be healed when truth finally conquers the lies that destroyed an innocent woman. The next time you visit the Tower of London and feel a sudden chill near Tower Green, remember that you may be standing in the presence of England's most persistent advocate for historical justice.